There's an expectation that a family must be our first place of love, safety, and feeling like we belong, right? But for many people, that's not the case. That's where some of the deepest wounds begin. Experiences like rejection, conflict, addiction, loss, and emotional distance can leave lasting marks that simply don't disappear as we grow older. And while childhood eventually ends, the impact seems to be lasting, and family trauma often shows up later in life in our relationships, the way we handle conflict, but how we trust others and also how we see ourselves. So what does it really mean to navigate family trauma as an adult? Can those early experiences be unpacked and healed? And how do we begin to build healthy boundaries and patterns that are without completely disconnecting from the people or the histories that have shaped us? Seems like a hard one, isn't it? And many of us are dealing with this in our different ways in our lives. Dr. Keitumetse Mashego is going to give us this very relevant conversation. Dr. Mashego is a clinical psychologist. Welcome, Doctor.
Morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this one is a tough one. Many people go through this, and at times we just put that little bandage on of acting like we've forgotten, or put that bandage on pretending that it didn't happen, putting that bandage on of making other people happy. But all those things, they don't work.
Definitely. And, the mind is so powerful. I think we've spoken many times about it, about the things stored in our subconscious. And people are not aware that the things that are stored there right from birth, actually from while we're still in the uterus.
Yeah.
So that's why we say, the first few 7 years of a child's life are so crucial and important, because that's where then they build those healthy bonds. Right. But it can also mean that if there is a lot of tragedy in that time, it can have, a lot of impact in the adulthood personality development and just that general life. And it's not limited to just the first 7 years. It's generally all experiences in our childhood era that will definitely, impact how we are as adults. Therefore, whatever you are suppressing, repressing, avoiding, ignoring, sometimes the mind also protects us from remembering, right? Just because we did not have the capacity to deal with what happened to us when we were young. But whatever it is that's happening that you're not dealing with, you will project in your adult relationships.
You know, what can make this hard sometimes is that in one family, we might not be experiencing the same traumas or even the same levels of the same trauma. So it's easy to feel like you are alone, even if you have siblings from the same family, you guys might not have the exact same experiences. So how do you start to, first of all, identify what these traumas are, especially if they've been largely unsaid in most African families?
Firstly, we need to realize that children can come from the same home and not have the same parents and not have the same experience, even though they had, the same parents biologically or physically, right? Just because of many factors, such as how the parent treated them and also what's going on internally within that child, right? How they receive the rejection. And maybe they feel rejected while the other siblings didn't feel rejected, they felt something else. And also just the resilience within each child will never be the same. So we have to understand that trauma is not exactly what happens to you, it's our reaction to it. It's what happens to you internally when something happens to you. And also time passes and that trauma can become whatever it is, depending on the psychological factors that is within you. Meaning, I can develop, for example, people-pleasing behaviors while you develop like a lot of aggression. But we had the same experience, but obviously we interpreted it differently. So I think that's where people don't understand that two people can have the same experience. One is resilient and the other one struggles with it. So we really need to understand that it's unique to each individual, and also that it requires you to be aware of self for you to move on. And sometimes people cannot make the link. They just see in their adult relationships that they're struggling. They need a professional, for example, like myself, to, make the link, to show them actually it started when this happened to you when you were 3 years of age.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back. I like going back because we have too many clever people in many sectors and social media who define things and maybe they're not the correct definitions, right? We're not going to do that on this show. Let's go back and try to define what is the clinical definition of trauma and how that is linked to the idea of family trauma.
So what happens is when we speak about family trauma, it's what happened within the family, or it could be a collective experience of something that happened within the family. Let's give examples. For example, a parent could be very toxic towards their children, and this is a trauma, or it can lead rather to a trauma response from the child. And we need to also make people aware that for a child, when they don't feel emotionally safe, that can be a traumatic experience for them. It feels like they're in a war. I always use that metaphor that for a child who does not feel emotionally secure for whatever reason within their primary caregiver setting, that can lead them to develop a lot of insecurities, right? It can be very traumatic for them because where do they run? Where do they go? This is all they're stuck with. This is all they know. Additionally, if there's a collective trauma, meaning maybe someone passes away, right? And for the child, it's not just the child experiencing this trauma, but it's the entire unit experiencing it. That can be this collective trauma, and it will impact individuals in that family or in that unit differently, as I mentioned, because of different factors. Maybe, it's their resilience, their personality, but also maybe they have added anxiety from other things, or they were predisposed to other things that, put them at more risk to develop a trauma response. But as definitely the trauma response differs from each individual, and some people can develop mental health issues because of the trauma experienced. But the clinical definition of trauma is basically that brain injury. And it's that when I say, the physical trauma is brain injury, but when we talk about psychological trauma, it's the reaction to it, right? How you react to the trauma is what causes the trauma to be severe in some cases.
Could you help us a little bit more? I really want to understand what trauma is, because sometimes we think it's an absolute violent occurrence that happens that only causes trauma, or violent speech, or things like that. Could you unpack it just a little bit more in defining it? Because I think some of us are just thinking the extremes, but there's so many nuances when we speak about trauma.
Definitely. Trauma is not what happened to you, it's your reaction, or what's happening internally to you when you think about that thing. And sometimes it's almost like a time passes, years later, right? You're still experiencing this trauma because you do not have the time to process it, and it still sort of haunts you. And when you get that self-awareness, it comes with a lot of guilt and shame sometimes because you can't help yourself. It's almost like a learned behavior because of what happened to you. And with that example, I use that when a child is born into this emotionally insecure or toxic environment, they can develop a trauma response, or experience internally something that's, mental health issues because of that experience. And that's traumatic for them. And that obviously, if it's not dealt with, when they are adults, right, their behaviors will indicate that there's something off about it. I always say to people that as an adult, if you're experiencing severe anxiety or whatever you're struggling with, you are not the one chosen to experience that. There's always something, there's a link. We need to now unpack, how you are at this point where you're struggling so much with anxiety. Yes, there might have been incidences that have triggered it or exacerbated it, but let's look at the root cause. And it's not always just the childhood experiences. It could be just past experiences, past relationships, past breakups that are leading to you, presenting in the way you present today. So it's always very important to unpack what's going on. Sometimes we're not aware, right? You come to my office, you're saying, I've got anxiety when I must speak in front of a crowd. And when you sit with me, we find out that actually when you were young, you gave a speech in primary school and your teacher said you're not good enough. And now you've internalized that you're not good enough. For years, you've been dealing with, this feeling like you're not good enough for years, and then until now we need to unpack, that it's not the truth, in spite of the evidence. in spite of you having presented in front
Yeah.
of crowds and done well, and in spite of the good feedback, you're just struggling to embrace that you're good enough. And that's how much a trauma can really limit someone, in their adult functioning.
All right, Dr. Mashego, we'll hear a little bit more about that after the break. Stay with us. We're unpacking childhood trauma, but moreover, how you can, navigate these family traumas as an adult and move to a path of healing.
The voice of the continent, now online, with all your sports fixtures, lifestyle, and more. Conversations are happening, and Channel Africa is at the heart of them. We tell the African story with clarity, pride, and purpose, reaching audiences that matter to your brand. Partner with us and connect your business with listeners across borders in multiple languages and markets. For partnership opportunities, sponsorship, or sales, email us at partnership@channelafrica.co.za. Channel Africa, the African perspective. Benjamin Mushatama and Palisatawo on the move.
We are speaking to Dr. Keitumetse Mashego, friend of Channel Africa here, clinical psychologist, as we unpack family trauma. Can those early experiences be unpacked and healed? Well, we move into that path of the conversation right now. There's been a huge trend, and I say this because it's been a huge buzzword that we're seeing on social media, healing your inner child. And a lot of people saying, oh, this heals my inner child, this heals my inner child. And it sort of speaks to a conversation about people saying, well, these are some of the things that were sort of traumas for me when I was younger. And by doing this, I'm healing that little person that lived inside of me that still feels those feelings. Are these two connected in any way? Or are we just using buzzwords wrong as usual?
Of course, there are incidences where they can be, overused. But honestly speaking, as I've indicated, that whatever happened to you in your childhood or when you were younger that wasn't processed, that wasn't offered a safe space, can lead or it really can cause a lot of dysfunction in your adult relationships, right? And it's sometimes very subtle. Sometimes it is in your face. It's very obvious to you and to other people. And the journey of healing it becomes quite important. The trick is trauma is never our fault, but the healing is always our responsibility, right? The onus is always on you to heal that inner child. And, sometimes we need to grieve the parent we never had, because that can be traumatic, where you were raised by someone who was extremely strict, or someone who was just not present, or someone who was just, neither here nor there, or they struggled with their own mental health issues, and therefore they were not able to show up for you as a child, right? Or you had an absent parent or someone who passed on, a parent, a caregiver who passed on. Therefore, they still that need to grieve that I did not have the life I thought I should have, right? Because rightfully so, as a child, you expect to be in a safe environment. But if you grow up in a place where you're not feeling safe, as an adult, you might need to grieve that I did not have, the childhood I would have loved to have, or that other people had, that I missed out on a mother who was loving, father who was loving, for many different reasons. So you need sometimes to grieve, the parent that you never had while they're still alive sometimes.
Sure.
And I think that's where the journey comes in, where you need to accept that my mother, the one that's chosen to be my mother, did not have and still does not have the capacity to be the parent I needed when I was young and even now as an adult. And when we open that box of that wound, it feels like it happened yesterday. It feels like that rejection is so fresh, and that's why it's so intense. But I always say to people, now you're walking with someone like myself, a professional, and you've got greater capacity to walk this journey, so you will be on the other side. Right, you need to go into the emotions first.
Yeah, it's so multi-layered, and I wish we would time to speak on this because traumas happen in multiple ways and manifest themselves differently depending on the circumstance, and that particular person's experience, right? So in some families, you have trauma that is not just from one person, but because maybe a family is dysfunctional, you can be getting certain treatments from various members of the family, and your trauma is manifesting in different ways because the fact of the multiple occurrences. Does that make sense what I'm saying? That, trauma can be exacerbated by how dysfunctional the situation is.
Definitely. I mean, it becomes complex and compounded trauma. And it's because, for example, as a child, where are you going to go? Right? This is the family you're stuck with that is toxic, that is chaotic, right? And where do you go except you are now being actually taught the toxicity, right? Sometimes that's why you get a child then they themselves, develop some of the dysfunctional habits that they've learned from the environment they grew up in. And it's the norm. So meaning that the abnormal has been normalized in that situation. And the journey comes where the child, who is an adult now, needs to become aware that actually where I grew up, it was actually very abnormal and toxic, and to embrace that and grieve that and come to a place to accept that I might need to love some of my relatives from afar because they're not healthy, they're not doing okay, and it's a choice, right? I sit with prisoners sometimes and you ask them, why do you do what you do? Right? Just to get into their mindset. And it could be males or females. And they will tell you that, Doc, when I was 3, this happened to me, so I'm angry. Right? Meaning the 3-year-old angry child is now manifesting in this adult who's killing without remorse, male or female, right? And it's because now it has become their personality and their character. And we say, we almost tend to brush it off and say, no, they were always like that. But no one is born angry. No one is born dysfunctional. It's because of the environment they find themselves in. And if they're not given the space to process and navigate that pain can possess you, and you really spew bile on people that did not harm you in the first place. So I think you need to understand how deep that wound can be. And just because you're not acknowledging it doesn't mean we're not seeing it, doesn't mean it's not manifesting, doesn't mean you're not projecting it. And that's the danger about it. So for people, they need to just start listening to what people say about them, and also just do the journey to see what triggers them so they can do the inner work to heal.
So really quickly, as we wrap up, Dr. Mashego, let's speak about the healing journey itself. Is it possible, particularly when those who have been an active part of your trauma perhaps are denying your trauma or ignoring it completely? How long does it actually take to heal from this?
Journey is unique to each individual, but definitely you can do the work and heal. Part of the healing is to grieve that the person that you expected more from has no capacity to show up. They're denying what they did. They're not in a place of ready to accept that. Therefore, remember, the healing is always about you. You cannot change adults, right? The aim is not to get someone to hear you. The aim is to heal that part that was hurt by the interaction with this person. So meaning you need to find a way to thrive in spite of what happened to you. It's not always easy because it means to sort of see people for who they are, which is what therapy does. It makes you see people for who they are, and you can't unsee it. And, you make decisions based on that and do the healing for yourself so that you can, do the work that needs to be done within you so that you can thrive in spite of what happened to you. And understand you are not what happened to you. There's always hope, for healing.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. Tell us really quickly where we can go and find you. I'm sure there's so many people that need this kind of professional support.
So I'm on WhatsApp at +27 82 858 7033. And also, if they Google my website, rebaonewellness.com, and at Dr. Dumi _DSM, they can find me in my socials. And that doctor is DR, not the full word.
Sure.
Yes. And also, they Google Dr. Keitumetse Mashego. They can also find me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure. You are a member of On the Move. So, yeah, it's official now, right, Doctor?
Yes, definitely. Thank you also for trusting me. It makes sense.
Fantastic. You always do. That's Dr. Keitumetse Mashego, clinical psychologist, helping us on that one. It's 9:30 Central African time. Let's get sports.